try to blow them over now. Much more difficult. The Sears Tower is 9 separate structural tubes of steel. 2 50 stories, 3 66 stories, 3 90 stories, and 2 at 110 stories that all support each other so the wind doesn't let it blow over. Brilliant idea. If you live in the shadow of the tallest building in the world, you better be impressive. To your right is a building called 311 South Wacker, designed by Cone Peterson Fox. Instead of making that building out of dark black steel, they made it out of pink marble. Instead of making those edges very sharp, as you see, you'll notice they're kind of beveled across the sides. And at the top of it, you see something that looks like a water tower up there. Well, it's not a water tower. It's actually filled with 2,000 fluorescent lights that outshines the Sears Tower at night and draws tenants to it. What if you have an older building, like this 1971 300 South Wacker? You have these big mechanicals here that are hiding your elevator shafts. How do you make your building more appealing? Well, they painted this mural of the Chicago River on the side, and that red dot is the "You Are Here" sign on the Chicago River. They draw you to their building where you might instead look across the street at that tallest building in the world. Returning to the Sears Tower, you're going to be able to barely see this after the break. But a lot of these skyscrapers require space to make money. And they make a third of their money from entertainment areas. So look to the top. You can barely see 5 glass boxes that are sticking out that they call the ledge. And if you're so inclined, you can step out on that ledge and look down 103 stories to the bottom. It's a rush.
You're doing it,
Mark.
Mark.
Support 5 tons. Doesn't matter. Whenever I walk out of that thing, I'm still tiptoeing because it's a heck of a drop when you look at it from that distance. That's how these places make
Oh,
their
5
money.
tons. What'd you have for brekkie?
So to your left,
Yeah,
you're going to see
See that video?
gateway buildings, the actual railroad tracks
Where
that
they-
I was talking about
no, CN Tower,
earlier on this tour.
Tried to
If
fix
you
it,
look
didn't
at
work.
the next level up coming up,
train.
you'll probably see
So
our
well
Metro
done.
train, which is a local commuter rail around this area, and Amtrak finishes there as well. These buildings use a concept called air rights to allow them to build above the railroad tracks. Railroad owns all the property that it sits on, but it also owns all the air above it. So they subsequently sell that air for millions of dollars, and then developers can build above it. Everybody wins. But if you're going to build above railroad tracks, you're not allowed to disrupt the train schedule. So these architects came up with an idea that didn't do that. You see all those columns in there deep? Every column of that building is built on the platforms on which you walk. If you ever come off the train, you'll see they're right in the middle, and you wonder why. Well, that's because they built those first, built a platform on top of it, then they built their big buildings, and they never disrupted the train schedules. Brilliant idea with air rights. But what if your building is in a place where those tracks are so narrow and so close together that you can't build a column in that location? Look ahead of you. You see a clock tower on a red brick building, and to the right of it, you will see a building that looks like it has a bridge up on top of that. White building is called the Boeing Building from 1990. Architects Perkins and Will. So on the left-hand side of that building, in that corner, those railroad tracks bend, and they're so close together, you could not put a pillar going down to the base or a column to support it. Architect Ralph Johnson came in and said, I've got an idea. What if we take the load of that building and we start on the right side and build straight up, and then we build a bridge, and that bridge will then hold up the entire left-hand side of that building. Kind of an amazing feat that there's no columns in that building that go down to the ground. That bridge supports it all. So we like to think he kept it there. He says because he wanted to highlight Chicago bridges. We say he just wanted to show his own genius in some ways.
Yeah.
Brilliant. To your left, you'll see 2 North Riverside, building from 1929 from Halliburton Root. Again, that era of Art Deco. And of course, back in then, they had to ignore those railroad tracks and build this big plaza above it. But we'll say that this plaza allows us our last visualization of a design element of Art Deco. Right below that clock we're passing, you will see an Egyptian theme. And long before the Bengals taught us to walk like an Egyptian, Egyptian themes were popular in the era of Art Deco because King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922 by the British. You combine that with that 1925 Paris Exposition and you get the design of Art Deco. Look at the buildings, you'll see both within. So let's return to our friend 150 North Riverside, that building that's built like this and goes up 52 stories. I told you how the Sears Tower has all that metal giving it structural support. And you'd say, wow, that clearly gives you that good wind resistance. Because at the top of these buildings, that wind coming west to east, which you're just feeling now, can approach 60 miles an hour. So how does that big domino resist that wind smacking in the side of it and not creating a big sway that literally makes the residents seasick? Different idea when you don't have other things to support it. Here, these structural engineers use a concept they call tuned mass liquid dampers. So at the top of this building are 8 large pools of water that weigh 1,173 tons. And when this building starts to sway in this direction, that water sloshes in the opposite direction like a damper, and it prevents it from swaying too far. A little scary. I always worry about this thing tipping a little bit, but they have to maintain the exact height of that water, and they can't let it evaporate or freeze. So it's monitored every day by those same structural engineers. So we're entering an area called the Confluence. It's one of the oldest parts of Chicago. It's where the main branch intersects with the south branch we were just on and the north branch straight ahead. Makes a Y. And if you look at a lot of Chicago municipal structures, like sewer gratings or fence railings, you will see a Y built into it. It's in representation of this historic site. This was so old that the 3 original bars in the city of Chicago were on each corner of this Y. And there was a little ferry that took you to all the corners in our first example of bar hopping here. That yellow bridge to your right, there was a structure there called the Wigwam where Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president in the 1860s. This is where Chicago was happening, all the way through its origin. So if you're going to build a building on the Confluence, better be impressive in some ways. If you look to your left, you'll see a big buff-colored, massive building with those green spandrels that sits beneath the windows. We still call the Merchandise Mart, but now you call it the Mart. Comes from 1930, the time of its completion. Again, largest warehouse in the world. Built by Marshall Fields. He built that for $39 million in 1930. Then the Depression really gets bad. He has to sell it to Joseph Kennedy right after World War II for $13 million in a fire sale. But don't worry about the Kennedys. They ended up reselling this thing in the 1990s for $575 million, making more than their money back on that original investment. So, classic Art Deco, piers going up, making it look taller like we talked about. You have all these things that look like Pez dispensers off at the base. This isn't really the Pez Dispenser Museum. That's actually the Chicago Retail Hall of Fame. Each one of those busts are the captains of Mercantile that actually built this city. 2 presidents of Sears, Marshall Fields, Montgomery Ward, JCPenney, they're all there. This building is what we call LEED certified. It's got gold status. LEED certified stands for leadership in energy and environmental design. Hard to do with an old building because it's not built to be friendly with the environment. They do it through low flush toilets, motion censored lights in the hallways, and different ways to recycle glass, lead, and paper. We're proud of that. Gold building, old building, new tricks. On the other side of this bridge to your left, you'll see a building above the Chicago Cut Steakhouse. That's one of our few platinum certified buildings because this building called 300 North LaSalle, if we were sitting here on a sunny day, you would see the sun reflecting off that glass, which would naturally heat up this building dramatically. These structural engineers coated that glass with a structure thinner than human hair. It actually reflects all of the infrared light and keeps that interior cool. But they went one step further. They actually cool this building with river water. It draws it up, cools the building, and spits it back out cleaner than it was before. And in doing so, they save 9 million gallons of potable drinking water a year. So it shows you the conscientious nature now of these architects design to become more friendly with the environment and of course limit our carbon footprint. Let's travel back to the 1929 era again. Straight ahead of you, off to your right in the distance, you'll see a building with a gold top on it, screen colored building. That building's called the Carbide and Carbon Building. And it comes, as I said, from 1929. Carbide and Carbon was rich. They had developed ever-ready dry cell batteries, Prestone antifreeze. They had a lot of money to spend at the foot of that new Michigan Avenue Bridge to build a spectacular structure. They hired the sons of Daniel Burnham Jr. and Hubert Burnham, and they said, we want to build something magnificent. So they met in that Stratosphere Lounge we talked about at the beginning, that speakeasy, when the waiter came and literally set a bottle of champagne on the table. Carbide and Carbon looked at it and said, we want to look just like that. And they did. Not urban legend. True. The base of that building is a black marble, if you walk by it later. Shaft is dyed dark green terracotta. And that summit where the gold is, that's true. 24 karat gold. So it's only 1/5000th of an inch thick, so don't think you're going to scrape it off and make yourself any money. But it does add to that era of Art Deco with pure opulence. On the other side of this bridge, on the left, you're going to see some structures that I know you've seen before. Chicagoans call them the corn cob buildings. But I want you to look at them carefully, because start to think about what they look like. They're actually circular in configuration. They've got no exterior design to them. So they're mid-century modernist in character, and they're round. Think about Bertram Goldberg, that guy that did River City. This is called Marina City. He did this way earlier, 1959 to 1967. He didn't think these were corn cobs. He wanted to build an adult playground. There was a movie theater, a bowling alley, everything here. He said the core of this building is like the trunk of a tree. And all those balconies are like the leaves of a tree. Remember, he liked nature. That's what he sees those buildings as, not the corn cob he's talking about. So on your left as well, you'll see the last building designed by Mies van Rohe as a great comparison. Now called AMA Plaza. Back when it was finished in 1971, it was called the IBM building. And this building is a true mid-century modernist structure, bound by rules that are so rigid that every one of these I-beams that comes down has to match up perfectly with all the cracks in the plaza, all the seams in the plaza. It's amazing how rigid the rules are in mid-century modernists when you get into it too. Now, our next building, postmodern, throws out all those rules. On your left-hand side will be the Trump International Hotel and Towers. Now, this building, Donald Trump was actually meeting with his architects, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, literally on the morning of 9/11, when the planes, sadly, of course, we all know, were hitting the buildings. He wanted to build the tallest building in the world on this site. Architects said no, city said no, so instead they decided to incorporate inside the memory of 9/11. This building's interior is a core of concrete, anywhere from 6 to 30 feet thick, that surrounds all the elevator shafts and all the stairwells. So if some disaster happens to this building, every resident gets down. Memory of that is actually built into the building, which is pretty impressive. To your left, approaching, on the other side of Wrigley, on the other side of the bridge, is another Art Deco-ish kind of a building that looks like it's got a medieval cathedral dropped on the roof of it. So medieval that it even has flying buttresses at the top, which medieval churches use to support their exterior walls. That building, we call it the Chicago Tribune Tower, but now it's called Chicago Tribune High. The owner of the Tribune at that time, and editor, was a guy named Colonel Robert McCormick. He was a World War I veteran, and he was really proud of that heritage of his World War I era. He had gone through the fields of Europe. He loved the churches of France. He wanted to build a building more spectacular than his buddy Wrigley had across the street a few years before. He sends out a contest. 23 countries, 250 entries for a $50,000 prize, which Howells and Hood said, listen, we know we have to build an Art Deco, but if we put a French cathedral on the roof, we know that McCormick will love it. And that's why it looks like that. McCormick signs off, and it's got that cathedral. Now McCormick, a little wacky, told all of his correspondents, whenever you're out in the world, and you're interviewing near some historical structure, get a little piece of it for me. Bring it home, and I'll put it in the side of my building. They did as they were ordered. And if you walk around that building later, you will see pieces of the Taj Mahal, the Great Wall of China, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Berlin Wall, all the amazing structural sites built into the sides of that building. You should walk around later. It's pretty cool to see. So if you look to your left, you'll see a building with the NBC peacock up on top. Looks very Art Deco, but actually it's from 1990, architect Adrian Smith, called NBC Towers. You can see it's got that classic Art Deco look as postmodern. But again, in the world of postmodern, it does still pay homage. If you look about a halfway up, you will see little L outcroppings on the side of that building. Those are actually flying buttresses that are structural, built into that building, because that building is paying homage to its neighbor, that 1925 tower. Look to your right in the distance, one block past James Hardy, you'll see a building with very odd-shaped balconies on it, which if you took those balconies off, looks just like any other museum box. That building is called Aqua, completed in 2009 by architect Jeannie Gang. Upon completion, the tallest building in the world designed by a woman's architectural firm. So the balconies from a structural engineering perspective, well, none of them are alike. They were computer generated. So when the wind smacks into the side of that building, it doesn't shift as much. You'll see them again on the other side here. What Jeannie Gang saw was something different. If you look at those balconies carefully, you'll see that they're all staggered, some as much as 12 feet out. So instead of being in a sterile environment like most skyscrapers, where you know your neighbor to your left and your neighbor to your right, here you can see your neighbors above and below you from many floors up and down. She was looking for a community in a skyscraper residential, which she certainly did achieve. So I'm going to talk a little bit about property here. Not a building. We're going to look to our left, because if we were sailing here in the 1600s and 1700s, none of this property was here. This was actually Lake Michigan. If you remember when I said the soldiers came down from Fort Dearborn, started building piers further and further out, as they built them further and further out on this side, all this sand built up behind it, creating landfill. They dumped all the wreckage from the Great Chicago Fire right there. So let's enter a character named George Wellington Streeter. Not really much of a gentleman, kind of a circus promoter, gun runner, and a crook. He is practicing gun running for Latin America out on Lake Michigan. Strands his steamboat right on this ground, gets out, looks on a map, says, hey, this is a part of Chicago, so he claims it for himself. He calls it the Free District of Lake Michigan right here. So if you're a king, you've got to get subjects. He gets subjects in squatters. He goes out, encourages them to live on his property for free. There ends up over 1,000 squatter shacks all in this area over here in the late 1800s. Now, if you were rich, you lived about a half mile in this distance, you did not like that view. So you start to get all the police involved, to the point where there was a pitched battle here of 500 Chicago police officers versus Streeter squatters. And the squatters won. They couldn't get rid of this guy until 1918. He starts selling alcohol on Sundays. Gets thrown in jail. Ends up selling hot dogs on the lake off to the right. They mow all of that down, but he still gets the last laugh, because this area now of multi-million-dollar condominiums is called Streeterville in his honor. So we're going to go under Lakeshore Drive Bridge. We'll see the lake. We're not going to go out there now. Let's get a peek of it. And the one thing I want you to notice is how beautiful our lakefront is here, because it's very well preserved. There's no buildings on the lake, on the other side of Lakeshore Drive, for a reason. If you remember, I talked to you about Montgomery Ward before. And Montgomery Ward literally wanted to preserve the lake for the people. He fought a 20-year battle against developers and the rich at his own expense to fight any new project that was being developed on our lakefront. He was vilifying the press for it. On his deathbed, he said, "I did this for the people of Chicago, but I doubt they'll ever appreciate it." We appreciate it because, as you can see, we've got an unobstructed lakefront that we are in his debt for, with no buildings on this side of Lakeshore Drive, except that one. So how did that 70-story skyscraper violate what Montgomery Ward worked so hard to prevent? That's called Lake Point Towers from 1968. And architects Shipwright and Heinrich did a little side move. They looked at a clause that said you could build a structure as a harbor enhancement on this area. They were talking about a lock house or something small. They built this 70-story residential structure that violated all the rules, which they closed down right after it was done. But of course, now it's one of the more popular residential sites in the city. Oprah lived there when she lived in this city, because the views from this side, as you'll see in a minute, are spectacular. The last structure we'll talk about before the term, I give you guys a few minutes to take some photos, is off to your right, or off to your left, sorry, called Navy Pier, which actually comes from 1916. Architect Charles Frost. It's called Navy Pier for a reason. This area here, you're going to be surprised to know, all of the aircraft carrier pilots from World War II were actually trained here, not on the coast. It was safe to train them inland. They left a little city called Glenview about 15 miles from here. They used Navy Pier as a reference. They landed on cargo ships with the tops cut off, painted like aircraft carriers. There's literally hundreds of World War II aircraft in the lake beyond us here, where some of them missed the mark. This area, of course, was popular for the Navy for years, morphed into a entertainment area where you can see that Ferris wheel, which is representative, of course, of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The architect of that World's Fair, Daniel Burnham, had told George Ferris, he said, make something more popular than that glorified lighthouse that the French did called the Eiffel Tower. So he said, I'm going to make a movable sculpture. The original Ferris wheel was twice as tall as that in 1893. We keep this Ferris wheel here as a memory, but of course you can look around your own towns to see it as well. So I'm going to be quiet for a couple minutes as Captain Jose turns this. You're going to stand up a minute, take a picture of this beautiful view we have today, and I'll pick up the tour after that.
Yeah, you should actually, yeah.
Architectural firm owned by Jeannie Gang. So that is now the tallest building in the world, designed by a woman's architectural firm. Now, Ms. Gang wanted to design this sort of what she called a frustra, which is like kind of like a Chinese takeout box, kind of stuck up and down end to end. So it looks curved, but it's not curved. Each column of that building is set either 5 inches forward or 5 inches back. And there's straight glass applied to it to give it the semblance or the appearance of it being a curved building.
Nah,
so
amazing.
That glass is equally important. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that it's made of 6 different shades of blue. And Jeannie Gang looks at that in one sense, because she has become a naturalist. And this area has over 14 million birds that cut through this area every year on the way to Canada. And by altering or staggering the colors of the glass, she thought that might not get the birds confused that it's the sky. Skyscrapers kill a lot of birds. That was her goal. But if you look at that carefully, what you will notice is that I'll tell you first, that if you build a building that's curved in some ways, that building heats up faster. Where it is narrowest, and slowest where it is widest. It's not like a rectangular building that heats up the same on every floor. So, here, the structural engineers put the darkest colored glass at the narrowest portions of the building and the lightest colored glass at the widest portions of the building to act like a thermal regulator from bottom to top and to assist with maintaining that heating and cooling. But if you look to the top of that building, you're saying, Steve, you said it was done, but I still see a hole on it up around the 83rd floor. And if you look at all the original designs of this building, that hole wasn't there. What happened was, the developer came in as they were breaking ground and said, listen, Ms. Gang, we want to make this about 5 inches wider. So I started digging it, saying, okay, we'll do that. As they got taller and taller, they found this building was swaying way more than they had anticipated on their initial designs based on just that 5 inches. They had to call an audible. They didn't want to tear it down, so they created a blow-through floor on the 83rd and 84th floors, which cuts that wind smacking into the building by about 25%. They also had to add those Tune Mass liquid dampers up there, but here we have 1,600 tons of water that prevents this thing from swaying too much. That comes with a little bit of a cost, because on the 83rd and 84th floors, 1 square foot costs $1,000. That's 8,000 square feet. $8 million lost because of that one little thing of making this building a little bit wider.
But it's still as a percentage of the volume.
So, that's the last building I have to talk about. I'm going to wind up my cruise here. And, you know, I could give all of you your little junior architect badge, but you'll just throw that in a drawer and never look at it. So I thought I'd be a little more philosophical by highlighting a few quotes, if the fire department allows me to. The first quote: architecture is the living embodiment of the times that we live in and a reflection on the times of our ancestors. Well, that's my quote. That's not so good. So let's go to Los Angeles Dodgers baseball announcer Vin Scully, who said, "It's a wonderful thing being a bridge to the past and to unite generations." Wait, that's the wrong Vin Scully. I want to tell you about Vincent Scully, professor of art and architecture at Yale University, who said, "Architecture is a continuing dialogue between generations carried out over time." Architecture is a continuing dialogue between generations carried out over time. That man was born in 1920 as we were leaving the era of neoclassical and moving on to the era of Art Deco. He died at age 97 in 2017 as these contemporary massive structures we could have never imagined were now lining the shores of rivers such as ours. The buildings around you reflect these changing times, the turning points of history, whether they reflect on each other in subtle and not so subtle ways. So I like to say, if postmodern goes to a party, they're going to ignore mid-century modern because they think they're kind of boring. But they're going to talk to their grandparents and incorporate their style into its style. So I would say the point of this cruise is to have you go back to your own hometown, wherever it be, Elmira, New York, San Francisco, Denver, and look up. Look at your own architecture, and you will see the same continuing dialogue between your own buildings that I just described to you today. So maybe baseball's Vin Scully did have it right when he said, "It's a wonderful thing being a bridge to the past and to unite generations." For after all, that's what all these buildings do. I want to thank you for your time today. You guys have been an amazing, attentive audience. I appreciate that.